Hello, my name is Gokey Gamer, coach of the Milwaukee Medichams, and this is log number 9 of testing the power of these Paradox Pokemon for Professor Turo. I've been recruited by the professor to help gather intel on these iron Pokemon by battling with them in the Soul-Do Association, and in exchange I have been promised a championship title as these Pokemon are just that powerful. And considering that we have not only made playoffs, but that we also earned the number 1 seed during the regular season, I'm inclined to believe the professor by this point. This week for the first round of playoffs, we're going to be battling a coach by the name of CJ Jensen and the Phoenix Incineroars, who fought their way into the final playoff spot similar to us last season. So needless to say, this fight won't be easy. My opponent has got the Pokemon Urshifu-Rapid Strike, Tornadus-Therian, Metagross, Torterra, Noivern, Florges, Raikou, Skeledirge, Hisuian Quillfish, and Tauros. The Tera captains consist of Torterra with the ground, water, and fairy types, and Tauros with the normal ghost and ice types. An extremely threatening team to be sure. I used Torterra back in the very first draft league I uploaded on this channel, so I know how threatening it can be, especially alongside other Pokemon like Raikou, Skeledirge, Tornadus-Therian, and Urshifu-Rapid. In terms of what I'm expecting to show, I'm thinking it's going to be Torterra, Urshifu, Tornadus, Metagross, Noivern, and Hisuian Quillfish. A very tough game to begin our playoffs run, but even still I think we've got quite the good chance to come out on top, especially since I've been promised that championship title. So let's talk about what I'm bringing and why I'm bringing it. The first Pokemon I want to talk about is none other than Spiny the Pincurchin. Once again holding a Terrain Extender along with the Electric Surge ability, this week we're rocking a special attacking set with max HP and special attack, alongside the moves Discharge, Scald, Spikes, and Memento. Discharge and Scald are perfect for weakening my opponent's team, perhaps even getting some favorable status effects. Spikes is perfect for chipping Pokemon down slowly but surely, and Memento is there to help with momentum, especially if Torterra switches in against me. Hoping to provide support with his terrain, status, hazards, and self-sacrifice tactics, I think Spiny will prove to be quite the annoying Pokemon for my opponent to deal with. Speaking of terrain support, the first Pokemon that I'm bringing that greatly benefits from the terrain is none other than our ace, Iron Valiant. Holding the choice specs to maximize our damage output, we've got max speed and max special attack alongside the moves Moonblast, Aura Sphere, Trick, and Vacuum Wave. Trick in particular is very solid into my opponent's team, as anything that wants to switch into Iron Valiant like Quillfish and Metagross don't want to be locked via specs. And if we choose to keep the specs, especially getting our speed buffed by Quark Drive in the electric terrain, first class could sweep my opponent's entire team. After our ace is going to be our Tera captain, Iron Thorns. Holding the wide lens because not missing our moves is more important than damage output this week for Mechagodzilla, we're rocking the usual Dragon Dance set with the moves Supercell Slam, Stone Edge, and Earthquake with max attack and enough speed to outspeed Noivern at +1. We've also got the Tera Flying type as a defensive typing to make sure we don't straight up lose to Torterra. Not much more needs to be said about this set, let's hope it claims some lives this week. Next, let's talk about the final Ironmon we're bringing this week, being Iron Moth. Holding the Life Orb this week, we've got the moves Fiery Dance, Sludge Wave, Morning Sun, and Discharge. We've also got max speed and as much special attack as we can have without going over my speed amount, so that Quark Drive will raise my speed instead of my special attack. The rest of my investment is in special defense. This set is very similar to Iron Valiant, meant to deal as much damage as possible and maybe even endgame sweep. Under the electric terrain, we can outspeed even a +2 Torterra, which is the main reason I'm running as much speed investment as I am. Hopefully the Hawaiian Pizza will be able to dance on our opponent's grave with their flames. Now let's talk about my 2 defensive walls, the first of which of course being Derp the Quagsire. Holding the Covert Cloak this week to make sure I don't get poisoned by Bar Barrage or any other random debuffs from moves like Shadow Ball, we've got the moves Earth Power, Encore, Toxic, and Recover, with max HP, max special defense, and a Bold Nature, boosting my regular defense with the Unaware ability. This set is meant to stop setup sweepers in their tracks and weaken things down with Toxic and Earth Power. Even Torterra won't be able to safely set up a Shell Smash due to Encore, which is the main reason I'm running that move. To be honest, I think this set could prove to be quite difficult for my opponent to take down. And finally, my last Pokemon is a fairly surprising defensive wall, Tumbler the BRAMBLEGHAST. Holding the Rocky Helmet and rocking max HP in defense, we've got the moves Power Whip, Rapid Spin, Strength Sap, and Leech Seed, as well as the ability Wind Rider. I almost ran the ability Infiltrator, but then thankfully quickly realized the only thing Tornadus can do to Wind Rider BRAMBLEGHAST is click Dark Pulse or Air Slash if they have it, and if they don't have those moves, that could completely remove one of the biggest threats to BRAMBLEGHAST in the first place. Meant to help out against specifically Urshifu-Rapid, I'm really hoping I can have some fun with this set. And that is the complete team we're bringing for this match. We've got a very tough game ahead of us, but to be honest, I think we actually do stand a pretty decent chance against my opponent. And besides, I still want that championship title. Nothing is going to stop us now. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and head into the battle. Meeting up with our opponent, we see a team that I pretty much expected. The only exception is that there's no Noivern, but considering Tornadus is there, that doesn't ultimately surprise me. Regardless, I decide that my lead this week will be Derp the Quagsire, as my opponent sends out Hisuian Quillfish, which is one of the most ideal leads for us, but I can't reliably go for Toxic now. I ultimately decide to go for the relatively safe Earth Power, doing a pretty significant chunk to Quillfish as my opponent goes for Spikes. Not the best situation, but certainly better than getting toxic to myself. I go for Earth Power again in case this was meant to be a sack lead, and my opponent actually opts to switch into Tornadus-Therian, successfully dodging the incoming attack. I do wish I had gone for a toxic here, but I still think my play was correct. Regardless, knowing that my opponent is probably going for a Grass Knot, I decide to switch into Bramblehast as my opponent clicks Knockoff, immediately knocking off my Rocky Helmet, but proving that there's a very good chance it might not have Dark Pulse on their moveset, meaning that Bramblehast can perfectly wall this mon now. A perfect example of this is my opponent goes for a Bleak Wind Storm, which I'm immune to thanks to Wind Rider, and successfully fire off a Strength Sap, restoring my HP all the way back up to full. Because I'm expecting my opponent to switch into the Ghost-type Skeledirge now, I decide to go for a Leech Seed, which ends up being exactly what happens. Now for a particularly aggressive play, I actually decide to switch into Mechagodzilla as I don't want any of my other Pokemon to take too much damage. Unsurprisingly, my opponent decides to go for a Shadow Ball, which takes out about half of my HP, but thankfully due to my speed investment, I should be able to outspeed Skeledirge on the next turn, heavily threatening it out. So as a result, instead of doing the usual thing and setting up with Dragon Dance, I actually decide to fire off a Stone Edge, worried my opponent will predict me attempting to set up and simply pick up the KO with another Shadow Ball. And thanks to the Wide Lens raising my odds, I not only land the Stone Edge, but deal enough damage to actually pick up the KO on the Fiery Croc, putting us already in an extremely advantageous position. In retaliation, my opponent decides to send in Metagross to fire off an extremely heavy hit. While I do fear a weakness policy set, I do still have Unaware in the back, so I actually decide to fire off a super effective Earthquake to deal as much damage as I can while also clicking the Tera button, making me immune to a possible Earthquake. Thankfully, we do outspeed and fire off an extremely heavy hit with our Earthquake, but then Metagross reveals that it is in fact holding the weakness policy, and unfortunately picks up the KO with a Meteor Mash. Well, thank goodness we're Unaware Quagsire. Speaking of, I send in Derp the Quagsire and figured that my opponent would rather try and save Metagross for a Bullet Punch on Iron Valiant, so I opt to go for a Toxic. Unfortunately, what ends up transpiring is that my opponent actually decides to stay in and click Knockoff, getting rid of my held Covert Cloak and doing a bit of chip damage to me, and essentially getting a free turn. In retaliation, I decide to go for a Recover as my opponent reveals Psychic Fangs, doing a pretty decent chunk of damage to me, but not enough to be a major threat as Recover heals considerably more HP than my opponent is dealing. So after one more turn healing up, I decide to chip this Pokemon down with an Earth Power. Well, that isn't good. While Metagross is no longer a threat since we have Vacuum Wave on Iron Valiant, we do unfortunately lose one of our major walls and chippers in this fight, and it is a trade that I don't really enjoy making. After Metagross gets a second unnecessary crit, Derp unfortunately falls and I'm forced to send an Iron Valiant to go for a Vacuum Wave. Thankfully, this huge tank with 4 arms does actually end up falling to the Vacuum Wave, but the unfortunate thing here is literally any Pokemon can come in for free, although granted my opponent doesn't know that I'm actually choice locked. Unsurprisingly, it's the faster Tornadus-Therian that actually comes in, which gives me a free switch back into Tumbler, and depending on what happens, I could actually Rapid Spin to get rid of these annoying spikes since my opponent's Ghost type is gone, which would be an absolutely amazing situation for us. Predicting the swap, Tornadus actually goes for a U-turn, dealing a decent chunk of damage into me as my opponent sends his lead back in, being Hisuian Quillfish. Here, predicting my opponent to possibly set up some more spikes on the switch and not wanting any of my other mons to tank a possible attack, I actually opt to go for a Leech Seed. Granted, I do think I should have gone for a Strength Sap here, but hindsight is 20/20 as my opponent actually deals a not so insignificant chunk of damage with a Crunch, which thankfully also reveals that we outspeed. Because if we didn't, then this wouldn't be nearly as favorable of a position. As a result, during the next turn I click Strength Sap for free, restoring my HP all the way back up to full as my opponent's second Crunch doesn't even do half of my health. In retaliation, a Quillfish switches back out into surprisingly Tornadus as I click my Rapid Spin button to get rid of the spikes, which puts me in an extremely amazing position. Here, knowing that Torterra is going to be quite the major threat, I actually decide to make a pretty offensive play, switching into none other than my Terrain Setter, Pincurchin, as my opponent clicks Knockoff, immediately getting rid of my Extender. My main goal here is to bait in Torterra to get it off the field as soon as possible so that perhaps either Bramblehast, Iron Valiant, or Iron Moth can win the game. Because my opponent clicked Knockoff over U-turn, I can get a free spike of my own up, punishing switches on everything except Tornadus, and unsurprisingly, my opponent clicks U-turn into the scary Terra Sweeper, Torterra. All according to plan. And just as quickly as Spiny came in, I say goodbye and give a salute as I have him go for Momentum, thankfully correctly predicting the Shell Smash, and even getting my opponent to reveal their Tera, being Tera Fairy, which is by far the best type for Hawaiian Pizza to come in for free and get a heavy hit off on literally anything that wants to switch in. I fire off a free Sludge Wave as my opponent unfortunately realizes that we do in fact still outspeed despite being at +2, and they decide to switch in Hisuian Quillfish, barely living the incoming attack. As a result, I decide to simply go for a Fiery Dance and hope for a chance to raise my special attack. But unfortunately, it's revealed that my opponent prepared to 1v1 our pizza as they go for an Aqua Jet, and while it doesn't even do half of our HP, there's absolutely zero chance of me being able to survive another Aqua Jet from Urshifu-Rapid. And as a result, that's exactly what ends up happening. Now granted, I could have swapped into BRAMBLEGHAST predicting this play, but I didn't want to risk taking much more damage than I needed to, as now that Pokemon like Skeledirge and Metagross are gone, BRAMBLEGHAST is actually a defensive win con. Speaking of, thankfully Hawaiian Pizza's death does give me a free switch into said win con, and now it's time to hope that we can finish this game. My opponent ends up opting to save Urshifu, going back into Tornadus as I once again recover my HP with Strength Sap. During the next turn, I actually decide to go for a Rapid Spin, as that way I can actually outspeed Torterra after a Shell Smash, and my opponent actually decides to stay in and click Knock Off, not doing that much damage at all, meaning on the next turn, I simply click Rapid Spin again as my opponent goes for a U-turn this time, switching into the one Pokemon that could cause some issues for us, being Torterra, which does take some damage from the spikes as well as my slow spin. During the next turn, I actually decide to go for a Leech Seed as my opponent goes for a Shell Smash. This is because I want to make sure that this big turtle is on a timer, losing HP as I recover more HP. I could have gone for a Power Whip here, but I was worried I wouldn't KO without the defense drop. Speaking of, despite my opponent's defenses being lowered again, I actually decided to go for a Strength Sap this time, as I am afraid of missing a Power Whip as my opponent clicks Tera Blast. Right. Well, that's not ideal. Worried about my opponent seeing this as a free opportunity to click Shell Smash, I realize that I have to risk the miss and fire a Power Whip. And thankfully we do manage to land our attack, meaning that all we have to do now is dodge a crit from the incoming Aqua Jet from Urshifu. And then we have this battle in the bag. So as my opponent sends in the Water Bear, I hold my breath and pray that this time, there is no crit. And my prayers are answered as we do manage to dodge the crit, meaning that we can safely fire off a Strength Sap, get back up to full HP, and slowly but surely win the entire battle with a 2-0 victory. I'm not going to go into detail about what happens for these last several turns, as it comes down to my opponent hoping they get a lucky hit off, using Regenerator Tornadus to keep it healthy, and using Urshifu as a swap to keep allowing Tornadus to recover HP. The spike set up by Spiny earlier in the match means that my opponent can only do this so many times, and eventually we even catch the Urshifu on a switch with the Power Whip, sealing my opponent's fate as BRAMBLEGHAST becomes the extremely unlikely endgame sweeper he knew he could be. While I hated how much the match ended up coming down to this much of a stall fest slash defensive win con, I knew it was my only chance at winning at this point, and Tumblr certainly did not disappoint. Personally, I don't think Stallfest is as annoying as people make it out to be, and yes, that includes when I'm on the receiving end of that exchange too. If my opponent had Air Slash instead of Bleak Wind Storm, or if Skeledirge was still alive, then I wouldn't have been able to make this set work, and I either would have lost this game, or it would have opened the door for one of my more offensive mons to sweep like Iron Moth. I say all of this because I didn't rely purely on this set to win the game, it just so happened that my opponent lost their few answers to it early on, and I was able to take advantage of that, just like what happened with Sword Power Iron Crown or Fiery Dance Iron Moth. I identified that my defensive wall and Chipper ended up being a win con, and as a result, he became the reason I won this game. Regardless, that will be the end of this log. If you're still watching, thank you so much for your support. If you guys enjoyed this panel and want to see more, then leave a like, comment, and subscribe as it helps our research on these Iron Mons immensely. I would also like to shout out CJ Jensen's channel as well. Their channel and their side of the battle will be linked down below. Please be sure to check them out. GG's to them again, and I wish them luck for their future battles ahead. Also, be sure to check out some of our other Draft League content for more battles from me. If you want to show support financially and earn some unique perks, then please be sure to check out my Ko-Fi link down below as well. With that, this is the end of the log. See you all next week for our semifinals game. Peace out, mates. Yes, Professor, that is exactly what I said. If I win the championship title, you have to release all of these Pokemon in your possession, and in exchange, I will report you to the authorities for illegal experimentation. You don't need to make these Pokemon stronger, they're already strong enough! Why do you feel the need to keep torturing these Pokemon with your research and experiments? You are lucky that I haven't reported you to the cops yet, and keep in mind, I can still do so. Especially if I win the championships, I'm sure they will be more than happy to listen to me. And as a warning, if my teammates disappear right before my finals game, people will get suspicious. Alright. I'm glad you see reason, Professor. And don't you worry, I'll make sure the whole world sees how powerful these Pokemon can be. Just you wait.